Firstly, just in terms of the depression literature, particularly because of the relationship between depression and loneliness, I want to explain to you a little bit about what we found with depression and how it affects our ability to recognise emotions in other people. Firstly, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people who are suffering from clinical depression, they tend to be less sensitive to emotions generally, so they're less sensitive to, you know, happiness, sadness, fear, whatever. It's also been shown in depressed people that they tend to read emotions very, very negatively. So they're more sensitive to sad faces. If they see a neutral face and they were asked to interpret it, they're more likely to say it's a sad face than it's a happy face. So they have negative biases. They focus on quite negative information in their environment. And there's also some research in depression that depressed people are less sensitive to happy faces. So not only are they more sensitive to sad faces, they actually have a reduced sensitivity to not only are they more sensitive to sad faces, but they have a reduced sensitivity to, I might have said that the wrong way around, more sensitive to sad and less sensitive to happy. And you can see this might be how depression might be maintained in somebody. And this just shows you just a little bit of the findings here. I'm just going to come over here and just show you properly. So this was a study done. So MDD stands for Major Depressive Disorder, and the white bars are your controls. And this was a study that looked at people who were depressed and people who were not depressed, and looked at how well they accurately identify emotions. And if you look here, anger, you see that's how good your controls are, your white bar. People who are depressed are less good at recognising anger. Then if you look at the emotion sadness, generally people who are depressed see more sadness. They're actually more accurate at recognising sadness. And then if you look at the happiness data here, you see you've got your controls, the people who are not depressed, and then your black bar of people who are sad. I mean, people who are depressed, they actually are less sensitive to happiness. So you can see these biases in emotional recognition that exist in depressed people. And actually this was another study that looked at people who are at high or low risk of depression. And they looked at how good they were at recognising fear, and they had either quite low fear, medium fear, or very high fear. And what they found was people who are at high risk of depression tend to see fear in their environment and are very good at recognising fearful faces. So in terms of how we recognise faces and how we recognise emotions within the faces, a lot of work's been done into sort of, what's activated in our brain when we see faces. And there's a huge amount of evidence that there's particular areas of our brain when we see faces, and different areas of the brain are activated versus when we see objects. For example, when we see a face, a particular area of our brain's activated, whereas when we see an object, a different area of our brain is activated. And it's kind of face recognition, emotional recognition, it's a really complex process. So there's a few major brain areas that are implicated. So it's been shown that, so these highlighted bits here in orangey red show areas of the brain that light up when we see a face, and that might be an unfamiliar face, or it might be a familiar face, a partner, a child, etc. So the areas that are involved in face recognition include the superior temporal sulcus and the fusiform gyrus. So these areas of our brain light up when we see a human face. And a bit more research has shown that when we look at emotion, when we read emotions in people's faces, an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is involved in emotional recognition, lights up. So the top one shows when we look at a fearful face, the amygdala lights up. This is another study looking at eye gaze, in which direction we look, whether it's left or right, or we don't maintain any eye gaze, and which area of the brain are activated. And again, the amygdala is activated when we when we sort of direct our eye gaze in a particular direction. So this shows you some of the brain areas involved when we're trying to recognise human faces. So this is kind of where it's sort of tied in with loneliness for me. One, we know that there's a high comorbidity between loneliness and depression. There's a statistically strong correlation between these two things, and some people have argued, are they distinct or are they the same thing? There is some research suggesting a causal relationship between loneliness and depressive symptomatology, that loneliness actually can increase your likelihood of developing depression. And some people have argued that loneliness and depression, they're both conceptually distinct and they're functionally distinct as well. And that's really what I wanted to look at, was look at, is loneliness functionally distinct from depression, particularly in terms of recognising emotions in people's faces? Because, you know, if you're not very good at recognising emotions and the non-verbal communication that's involved, that could, you know, make your loneliness worse, or it can make your loneliness, you know, possibly get worse and sink into, you know, depression. So a little bit of work has actually been done on studies looking at brain areas that are involved in loneliness, and I found two big studies. One study looked at a brain region that's involved in face recognition, the posterior superior temporal sulcus, and what they did was a direct correlation between, they used the UCLA loneliness scale, and they looked at how lonely people were and the amount of grey matter volume in this brain region. And what they found was that as people got more lonely, and this was particularly on the higher end of the scale, there was a reduction in grey matter volume in their brains. And what they thought mediated this relationship was that people who are lonely tend to be poor at following you know, gaze cues. So if you're shown a face and you're asked, you know, are the eyes pointing left, right, central, nowhere? People who are lonely were quite poor at being able to follow eye gaze information. And that was the factor that was supposed to mediate this relationship. So here what we have is some evidence that lonely people are poor at, you know, face recognition, gaze direction being one of the issues, and that this is mediated by an area of the brain called the posterior superior temporal sulcus. And just one other study, because I found two studies, is this study looked at people who are lonely, and they looked at an area of the brain called the ventral striatum. And for those of you who don't know, the ventral striatum is involved when we experience reward or pleasure. So generally, you know, if we have a really good meal, our ventral striatum in our brain gets really excited. If you have an alcoholic drink, your ventral striatum gets very excited. If you have sex with someone and you enjoy yourself, your ventral striatum gets very excited. So this is an area of our brains that's involved in, when we experience pleasure, this area of the brain gets excited. So what they did in this study was they looked at people who were either high or low in loneliness, and they exposed them to different stimuli. So they exposed them either to pleasant pictures of people or really unpleasant pictures of people. So people engaging in, you know, in joyful behaviours versus horrid behaviours. And they also looked at other stimuli, so not stimuli that were objects. So either these were objects we might find pleasant or objects that we might find unpleasant. And just this graph shows you nicely. If you look at the this sort of this dark red line, when lonely people were shown pleasant pictures of people, you don't get much brain activation in this brain region. Whereas if you compare it with people who are low in loneliness but see pleasant pictures of people, that's the blue line, you get a lot more neural activation. And likewise, another thing that was interesting here was that you got the opposite effect when you looked at the pleasant and unpleasant objects. So with the lower lonely people, when they saw unpleasant objects, you didn't actually get that much neural activity in this brain region. But when the people who were high in loneliness looked at unpleasant objects, you can see you get a lot more neural activation. So the idea here is that lonely people, they don't respond as well to, you know, pleasant faces, and they respond more to unpleasant social stimuli. So 2 studies showing that loneliness is associated with brain changes, and those changes are to do with, you know, the sort of social stimuli, face recognition, face identity, etc. So I really wanted to follow this on and look at how does loneliness affect our ability to accurately recognise different emotions in people's faces, which had never been done before. So what we did was, in this study, we screened 321 people. We screened them for levels of loneliness and for levels of depression. And in the study, we ended up, and I'll explain why at the end, with only 51 participants. What we got our participants to do was this Ekman emotional phrase processing tasks. They were presented with different images of different emotions, and they had to identify what the emotion was. And we assessed how accurate they are at identifying different emotions. So how accurate were they at identifying sadness versus happiness versus fear, etc. We looked at how quickly they responded. So, you know, did they take a long time to identify an emotion, or were they relatively quick at identifying an emotion? And we also looked at, if we present lonely people with neutral faces, so faces that actually don't show any emotion, how do they respond to it? You know, do they read a neutral face as being happy, or do they see it more negatively? Do they have a negative bias towards it? So just in terms of the screening, we did an online screening using some software called Qualtrics. So basically, participants read an information sheet of the study online, they gave their informed consent online, and then they filled in 2 different questionnaires to assess their levels of depression and their levels of loneliness. So depression we measured using something called a well-validated tool called the Beck Depression Inventory. And everyone filled this in, and everyone got scored, and people were scored. We were interested in people who were either low in depression or very high in depression, and we used well-validated cut-offs. We also looked at people's how lonely they were, and for this we used the UCLA loneliness test. So again, online, they filled this in for us, and we used cut-offs. So we used the top and bottom quintile. So people who we rated as low lonely scored within 20 and 30 on the UCLA loneliness scale, and people who we rated as very high lonely scored from 60 to 80 in the UCL loneliness scale. And in the end, we ended up with 4 different groups of participants. So either groups who were high in loneliness but low in depression, or people who were high in loneliness and, have I said it the right way around? I'm going to go through it on the slide. So either we had people who were highly lonely and they're not depressed, because we're trying to separate loneliness from depression on emotional regulation, or we had people who were highly depressed but not lonely, or we had people who were both high depressed and high lonely, and finally we had our control group, which were people who were both low lonely and they're not depressed as well. So then they did the emotional face processing task. They did it on a computer. It was very, very simple. They firstly saw a blank screen on the computer which had a cross on it. Then they saw a face that was on the screen for 500 milliseconds. This face expressed one of the 6 emotions at a number of different intensities. So it could be a neutral face, it could be 25% of a particular emotion, 50%, 75%, or 100% of a particular emotion. And then the next screen appeared, which had the 6 emotions on the screen, and they used the computer to press which emotion they thought it was. So that was how we conducted the study. So just now in terms of our results, so what we found was that firstly, we looked at how neutral faces are classified, and what we found is that loneliness is distinct from depression, and lonely people tend to classify. So so these are people who are low depressed. So this is our control group, people who are low depressed and low lonely. And you see how many neutral faces they classify as sad. This is people who are not depressed but are very high in loneliness, and you can see they show this negative bias. They're more likely to classify a neutral face as sad. And this is our high depressed group, and this has been shown before, and we replicated this finding, is that people who are high depressed again have this negative bias. When they see a neutral face, they tend to interpret it negatively as a sad face. The next study we looked at is how accurate were our groups at identifying sadness. And the main effect we got here was, we didn't see an effect of depression here. What we saw was people that were high on loneliness tend to be more accurate when they see sad faces. Again, a negative bias towards sadness. I'm just reporting some of the main results. And the final result was of interest to us, was that what we found was that people who are lonely tend to be worse at recognising fearful faces. We actually expected them to be better, but we got the opposite result. They tend to be poorer at recognising a fearful face. So you can see these green bars, regardless of whether they had low depression or high depression, they tend to be poorer at recognising fearful faces. So what did we conclude from this study? So firstly, we found that using the Ekman emotional face processing task, we've been able to show for the first time that loneliness, independent of depression, impairs emotional face processing. So lonely people are worse at processing facial emotional information. And the effect that that can have is that it can not only it can lead to the onset of loneliness, but it can also maintain loneliness if you're constantly focusing on negative information within your environment. Our depression findings support existing research that people who are depressed tend to have a negative bias and focus more on negative information in their environment. We found that also lonely people more accurate at seeing sad faces. The interesting thing we found was that people who were high in loneliness were less accurate at identifying fearful faces. And one thing we hypothesised that might be going on here is that if when somebody's lonely, they're always kind of seeing fear in their environment and quite a threatening environment, they might not be so good at picking it out when it's actually there. That's just one hypothesis that we've speculated. So just in some of the further things that came up in this study, from this study, obviously we largely used quite a young population. They tended to be university students, so we'd really be interested in repeating this study in an older population and seeing do they show similar, do people who are high in loneliness, older people who are high in loneliness, show similar biases to facial emotion, these negative biases. We're also interested, obviously, in, what are the brain mechanisms, what areas of the brain are involved when lonely people are not so good at recognising facial emotions. And given what we've found in the depression literature, areas that we'd look at would be areas like the amygdala, the posterior temporal sulcus. Another interesting thing that's come out of this is that one way you could tackle loneliness is by training people to actually focus more on the positive, the positive things about their environment rather than focusing exclusively on the negative things. And you get things like cognitive bias modification, trying to teach people to focus more on the positive things. And I actually, in a very nice way, I've tried to do this with my own mother, because she was widowed 7 years ago, so she's alone. And often when I have a conversation with her, she tends to focus on negative things that happened 5 years ago or even 15 or 20 years ago. And I say, Mum, you've got to stop this. Focus on the good things that happened in your life, because actually it will increase your well-being generally. So that's just my personal story. There's also, our study shows that the fact that we found it hard to recruit people who were high and lonely and not depressed, or people who were high depressed and not lonely, suggests there is a huge comorbidity between depression and loneliness, but they are functionally distinct, as shown from our study. And we've only looked at one aspect of social cognition, you know, face recognition. There's lots of other aspects to social cognition, such as how well you recognise eye gaze information. Are you good at identifying identity that that could also be explored? So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.